Bé, bona tarda, benvinguts. És per mi un plaer fer aquesta presentació avui, que crec que no l'havia fet, de fet crec que no l'havia presentat mai a Mònica Heller, tot i que tenim una llarga trajectòria de col·laboració en docència i en recerca, especialment des que va ser l'examinadora de la meva tesi doctoral. Sí, i me'n queda un bon record. La professora Heller és professora de la Universitat de Toronto, que concretament a dins el Centre de Recherche pour l'Educació Franco-Ontarienne, que és un centre de recerca dedicat a la recerca sobretot en matèria educativa i focalitzada en la comunitat francòfona de l'Ontario. És important aquí per seguir aquesta conferència tenir clar que hi ha francòfons fora de Quebec, al Canadà, i bastants, i que és més el tema d'estudi de la Mònica que no específicament el de Quebec. Tot i que la seva tesi, de fet, el primer treball de recerca que coneixem, anava, si ho dic malament, em corregeixes, sobre els usos lingüístics a dins d'una fàbrica de cervesa, era? Els usos lingüístics i una mica la dinàmica de canvi lingüístic que hi havia fa un temps en el món empresarial al Quebec, i potser per això és una persona que sempre ha tingut molt en mente la necessitat de connectar els aspectes lingüístics, els aspectes sociolingüístics, d'ús lingüístic amb qüestions polítiques i en qüestions econòmiques. I jo recordo que quan vaig començar-me a familiaritzar amb la sociolingüística fora de Catalunya, em trobava molt sovint amb estudis que no m'interessaven gaire perquè s'interessaven molt per l'aspecte de detall lingüístic i molt tècnic del bilingüisme o dels usos lingüístics, i en canvi en el treball de Mònica Heller hi podia trobar diguéssim aquelles coses que connectaven amb aspectes polítics i econòmics que són els que particularment m'interessaven. Això ve sobre la creença, evidentment, que la manera com utilitzem les llengües i allò que pensem sobre les llengües està molt relacionat amb com està organitzada la nostra societat i de quina manera utilitzem les llengües. I que ara que la nostra societat està canviant, que hi ha tot aquest procés de globalització que té implicacions importants polítiques i econòmiques, també està canviant aquesta manera d'utilitzar la llengua i aquesta manera de pensar sobre les llengües que hi ha hagut en els darrers potser 200 anys en el món que coneixem. I aquest és el tema de la xerrada d'avui i la invitem a començar-la i a parlar ella, que és el que hem vingut.
Moltes gràcies. Ho sento, no parlo molt bé català i com se diuen els translators?
Els traductors.
Els traductors diuen que I have to speak only one language or else they can't translate. So they say speak English and nothing else. If I can find a word in Catalan here and there, I can use it, but that's all. This is very difficult for me to do, but I will do my best. And so what I want to do today is to talk first a little bit about the ways in which the role of language and our ideas about language are shifting under new conditions, particularly under the conditions of the globalized new economy, and then sort of walk you through one particular example from a tiny little place in Eastern Ontario where there are francophones, as Joanne has very kindly and usefully pointed out, to give you a sense of the kinds of things that I think are going on and the ways in which, in particular, the discourses, the ways in which we've thought in terms of language rights, linguistic minority rights in particular, are now moving more and more towards discourses based on economic considerations, in particular towards ideas about language as a commodity, as something that can be exchanged and that has economic value in a variety of different markets in the new economy. And there are two in particular that I'll get to in a moment, but I'll be focusing most on the ways in which language and identity are becoming important products as well as work processes in areas and sectors like tourism, which is one of the major booming industries of our time. And a lot of what I have to say comes from years of collaboration with many people in this room, and notably on this particular question with Joanne, whom I have sort of dragged around various tourist sites of Francophone Canada. It's very nice to have an enthusiastic partner going, ooh, this is interesting. And so we've been trying to do some work, comparative work, also with Catherine Jones in Wales, on how some of these issues are unfolding in Catalonia, in Wales, and in Francophone Canada. I also need to mention that the work that I'll be presenting is not just only mine, but it's based on many years of collaboration with a number of colleagues and students in Canada and in Europe. So let me talk first about the increasing role of language in the new economy, and talk about the ways in which that lies behind, I think, some of the changes that I see going on. Oh, I forgot to ask you, you'll tell me when I have like 10 minutes, 5 minutes, and I should shut up, right? Okay. So I think one of the things that we really need to remember are the ways in which we've really moved in the last 20, 30 years from an economy based on primary resources, the extraction of primary resources, and industry into what we think of as a new economy based on services and information. And I don't need to tell you about this, you've been living through this as much as we have in Canada. And so that move from the primary and secondary sector economy into the tertiary economy has been one aspect of the ways in which the role of language has changed hugely. Partly because even the primary and secondary sectors have become computerized. They depend much more on various forms of literacy than they did in the past, and also because we do other things in the services and information economy than we used to. And so we need to remember that in the old economy, language wasn't so central. I have a colleague in France, Josiane Boutet, who talks about the ways in which, in the old economy, communication tended to be really regulated. You weren't supposed to talk on the work floor. You might be able to talk a little bit when you're having your coffee break or coming into work or out of work, but you're supposed to focus on the physical production of physical objects. Whereas now, when you think about things like call centers or tourism services, these are all sectors in which language is central not only to the process of doing the work, but is often also the product of work. For example, our colleagues, the traductors, who are hidden somewhere, where are they? Behind the screen, okay. You can put your hand up. What they are doing right now is engaging in a process of work which is centrally linguistic and producing the product of their work, which is the translation that some of you are hearing through your écouteur, your auriculas. Ooh, I like that. So more and more we have this kind of way in which we can think about language as being both the process of work and the product of work. I have a colleague in Switzerland, Alexandre Duchesne, who's been doing work on these kinds of workplaces as well, and he talks about the ways in which the main d'oeuvre is transformed into the parole d'oeuvre. And working together a couple of weeks ago, I thought, what really this means is that we can think about the workforce more and more as being the word force. So I'll give you one particular example. Joanne mentioned the beer factory, the brewery in which I did work in the late 1970s in Montreal. And as a sociolinguist, it was a challenge in many ways because most of the work that was being done in these huge chambers with huge machines that were making so much noise that in fact most of the workers had to wear, are they also auriculas? No. Okay, well, those things, protecciones. And they had developed a kind of a very elementary gesture system so that when they had to signal that something broke down, for example, they could use a gesture. But they were not supposed to and were not able to talk on the line of production. Now, those kinds of big manufacturing companies in Canada, most of them, in many cases, they've been downsized. Some of them have been exported to China, to India. They've been computerized. So the ways in which huge numbers of people were employed in those areas has changed a lot. And they've been replaced by new kinds of work areas. So about 25 years later, I found myself in a call center, in Moncton, New Brunswick, which is another typical kind of place that used to have heavy industry. Most of the francophones in Moncton worked for the railway, in the railway yards, doing heavy metal work. Those rail yards closed down, along with all of similar kinds of companies in the 1980s, throwing most of the men into chômage, unemployment. I don't know what I would do without you. And they were replaced. The provincial government went very, very explicitly and consciously into attracting call centers based on the fact that that population, the Francophone minority population of New Brunswick, was bilingual. And so about 25 years after I'd done this work in the brewery in Montreal, I was in a call center in Moncton, and I was sort of waiting for somebody, and I was listening, and there was this big room with about 100 workers all sitting at their workstations. And what I was hearing was lots of this murmuring of 100 voices. And so what we've got is the replacement of the floor of the shop from a heavy industry noise of machinery to the information and service work of 100 women talking. So you have 500 men doing physical work and not talking or hearing, and you have 100 women talking as the process and the product of their work. So it's that kind of clash, that kind of contrast. So within my own adult lifetime, within my own research career, I've been able to see. Who knows what we'll see by the time I retire. So it's this kind of new centrality of language, whether we're talking about multilingualism or monolingualism, language has a new centrality. But we also have an increasing centrality of linguistic variability, including what we typically think of as multilingualism, for a number of different reasons. One of these reasons has to do with exactly the kind of expanded networks of production and consumption that lead to things like the moving of the production of material goods away from North America or Europe and to places like India or China. These are also places with increasing consumer bases, so they're also markets that are increasingly interesting. So I think there are ways in which we've talked about globalization as being something radically new. I follow people like Anthony Giddens in thinking that really I think what's going on is that we've followed increasing expansion of capitalism in terms of production and consumption, and what we have now is just more expansion rather than something radically new. But those new conditions of expansion are changing, in particular our ideas about language and identity in ways that may well have more revolutionary consequences down the road. So we have expanded networks of production and consumption, which means that we are dealing with producers and consumers who have wildly different linguistic repertoires from the ones that we're used to. We're also used to being able to, in some sense, control the linguistic repertoires by having a control over a national market. There are ways in which I would argue that the nation state, with its ideas about uniform languages, uniform cultures, uniform communities, uniform populations, has been at the source of our ideologies of language and identity. And so that market has produced that notion of uniformity and that emphasis on monolingualism. But as we can no longer work things through the limits of the national market, as we've had to expand away from across many national markets and markets that aren't well defined by nation states at all, we also have to deal with the linguistic variability that comes with that. And so our ability to control things in terms of uniformity doesn't work so well anymore. In addition, one of the hallmarks of how we manage the new economy is through flexibility. So one of the ways in which the private sector, in which capital has tried to control things and make things efficient, is by making sure that people can do more than one thing. So in the past, you had people who had one job and they did that job all the time on the production line. Now we expect people to be able to turn around. If we don't need you today doing this, then you need to be able to turn around and spend some time doing that. And that flexibility also entails a certain amount of linguistic variability. And the third dimension that I think helps us understand why multilingualism contrary to all of our talk about how everybody is going to be speaking English tomorrow, how multilingualism, I think, is actually more important than it used to be, is that one of the characteristics of this expanded market is that we've also had a kind of a saturation of the old industrial markets, and we've been interested more and more in the development of what we can think of as niche markets. And it's those niche markets that are going to underlie what I'm going to be talking about further. So those niche markets, what those niche markets mean is that we want to be able to target specific kinds of consumer markets, and we want to be able to add value to the kind of industrial products that it's efficient to produce in large quantities. So how do you make something more valuable? One of the ways in which you add value to it is to add symbolic capital to it, to add symbolic value to it. One way to do that is to focus on cultural exoticism, linguistic variability, and so there are all kinds of ways in which the importance of niche markets has actually opened up space, I think, for being able to to produce products and to find a market for particular locally identified kinds of products. And that's one of the reasons, I think, that Catalonia is so successful in tourism. I mean, there's many reasons why Catalonia is successful in tourism, because it's a wonderful place. But there is that notion of something very specific that you can't get elsewhere, and that has added value to the kinds of other activities like going to the beach or sitting on a terrace and having a good meal that you might be able to get in other parts of Europe, other parts of the world. So those three things, the expansion of the market, flexibility, and added value, the importance of niche markets, these are all things which I think actually underlie the development of the value of multilingualism. Okay. So this has an important impact on the way we used to do things. So we used to have these tailorist management practices. So in the brewery we had, these guys who were at the same place on the same line all the time. They were doing the same operation, whether it was cleaning the bottles or filling the bottles or operating the machine that put the caps on the bottles, and that was operated through standardization of practices in which everybody had a particular place. And as I was saying earlier, that went along with our kind of nationalist ideas about we have standardized practices for standardized nation states in which everybody speaks the same language and everybody does the same thing in the same way. And so the standardized homogeneous units, whether they're at the level of politics or at the level of economic production, are challenged precisely by this kind of extra-national, transnational movement of goods and of people and of communication, but also by the variability that the new ways of doing things encounter. But I think this impact comes in two different forms. It comes, as I was saying earlier, in the form of authenticity, a kind of fetishized exoticism which really achieves the ability of particular local markets of adding symbolic value to products. But we also see it in the form of understanding language as a kind of a technical skill. Our traductores will be an example of that kind of movement. So we have this kind of split currently in ways in which we see that the new centrality of language in the new economy can be seen both in the ways in which we try to manage language in a kind of tailorist way. So we have standardized tests. We make kids write these standardized tests. In Ontario, we do this 4 times between the age of 8 and the age of 17. So we're constantly making our kids do these standardized tests to make sure that we can standardize linguistic skill across populations so that we can exchange understanding what it means to be competent in English with what it means to be competent in French or what it means to be competent in Spanish or in Quechua or in any other language that we might want to talk about, so that we can measure that competence and so that we can use it as a way of evaluating people when they want to work in these new sectors as translators, as call center representatives, as service workers in tourism, or any of the other kinds of jobs that are currently really the booming sector of the economy. So we're trying to use these kinds of standardized Taylorist practices in order to be able to regulate language as a technical skill in these kinds of ways. There's an entire association called the Globalization and Localization Association, which has been in existence since about the year 2000, whose job it is to do the work on language to make it possible to easily move across different spaces, geographically, demographically, and also across languages. And their big thing is speech technology. So they're going to handle this by having computers do the translation for you. We're going to get rid of the human being altogether. Lucentu, traductors. So ideally, you'll be able to come in here, have a machine you plug into your ear, and have that translation work for you in that way. They don't want to know about the human side of things. So that's one technique, that's one tactic that has been developing, and that's been a booming industry. There's lots and lots of money in that particular sector, and it's very appealing to the private sector because it allows them to feel that they can use their old-style management practices to regulate language as well. Now, there's a lot that I could say about that. I'm going to close this piece off because I don't have time today. But the short story is, it turns out it's very hard to regulate language in that way. So this is causing lots and lots of problems, which people are trying to deal with, and it's a bit of a mess, and I find it very interesting, and I'm trying to follow that mess and to see what happens. But I'm not going to talk much more about that now. What I want to talk about more is about the other side of things, which are the ways in which language turns up as a kind of a guarantee of authenticity in the packaging of goods that are understood as having added value because precisely they're understood as located in a particular time and place. So the main area, as I was saying earlier, for that is tourism. So that people, are used to the kind of the package tours, 2 weeks, 1 week in a hotel, which could be in Cancun in Mexico, or it could be on the Costa Blanca in Spain, or it could be in Cyprus. Same hotel, same swimming pool, same margaritas, more or less, same sun, same sea, right? That's the industrial product, right? But we have to some extent saturated that market and are now looking for ways in which we can add symbolic value, and heritage tourism and cultural tourism are some of the ways in which that's happening. Now that's happening precisely at the same time as a lot of the minority communities who have been involved in essentially marginal areas of the economy, in agriculture, in fishing, in mining, are losing that basis of reproduction and are looking around for ways to reproduce themselves on a new economic basis. And so certainly one of the things that we've been seeing in Francophone Canada is a move on the part of precisely those populations into developing heritage tourism. I think in Catalonia it's more complicated, and we can talk about that later, but that's one of the things Joanna and I are trying to figure out is, what's the same and what's different and why. But I won't talk about Catalonia since I don't know about it, so I'll talk about what I do know about. So what we have are populations which were, as I said, used to be based on mining, based on the lumber industry, based on agriculture, based on fishing, and based on heavy industry, all of which underwent a kind of a deep restructuring starting in the 1980s in ways which really threatened the possibility of Francophone communities in Canada to sustain themselves. And one of the areas that they've gone into has been heritage tourism. And so I'm going to tell you the story about one of these as an example of some of the ways in which the shift has had an impact. And particularly, what I want to argue is that we have populations which have been constructed largely by the nation state as linguistic minorities. They didn't necessarily think of themselves in that way 200 years ago or even 150 years ago. Linguistic minorities which have been taught how to and learned very well how to talk to the centralized state in order to gain resources in ways which were justified, legitimized through a discourse of minority language rights. The rights of a linguistic minority to its own language, to its own institutions, to its own cultural space, a discourse which is deeply familiar to you. There are many ways in which one of the reasons I feel so at home here is that I see text that I can translate between Catalan and French practically word for word. It's really the same way of looking at things and arguing about things. And we have the same arguments, the same arguments. However, the state itself was able to do that when it was essentially operating as a welfare state. And the late 1980s, which was the same time of economic crisis, also led the state to reorient itself towards a neoliberal basis. And so it could no longer justify just sort of giving money to communities to do artistic or literary or cultural activities in order to just maintain the community, which is essentially a welfare state kind of logic. It had to justify what it was doing on the basis of economic development. And so what we're going to see here is a story of one particular community in Eastern Ontario, which has gone through that development, that process. So this community is located in an area which is, in fact, the majority of the population is French-speaking, but in a province which is dominated, Ontario, which is dominated by English speakers. And it's not far from the national capital, Ottawa, which since the late 1960s has been officially bilingual, but as most of us say, you know, somehow or other, the bilingual lady is never there when you want to get a government service. And so the relationship between the real bilingualism and the official bilingualism of the state is another matter altogether. Having said that, it's a source of a lot of jobs. This area was primarily agricultural, a combination of agriculture and lumber, in ways which went into crisis, exactly along the lines that every place else did across the rest of Canada. But it was also a place that had a long tradition of political mobilization for linguistic minority rights, had an important infrastructure in terms of the minority, what we call le milieu associatif, the cultural and social associations, which are kind of the basis of the distribution of language and identity-related resources, and also an important institutional base in schooling and to a lesser extent in healthcare and sort of social services. So the elite there has developed over the last 30 years a very, very well-developed argument for the importance of language and culture and identity. They know how to talk to the state to get resources for schools. They know how to fight with the state in the courts to get language rights, and that's what they've been used to doing. But then all of a sudden, the state turned around and said, you can't, this is not, we won't fund this anymore. What you have to do is community economic development. And so what they did was to develop a historical pageant. This historical pageant is called l'écho d'un peuple, the echo of a people. How would you say it in Catalan? Peuple. Very good, okay. I don't need it. And what they did in many ways, what these illustrations show you here, are the kinds of images of telling the history, the glorious history of the Francophone people in Ontario, taking us across time from the moment of arrival of the French across the seas. This is a sort of a canonical image of the French arriving with the boat across the seas and being welcomed with open arms by the indigenous population. So we got along fine. In fact, we got along so well that probably most of us are mixed blood because, the people on this boat were mainly guys, and it was a while before the women turned up, so really we're probably all indigenous. And I can talk a little bit about why this discourse of harmony is so important, but we're certainly not going to talk about conflict or anything bad. So in the early years of this pageant, which is now in its 4th year of operation, so this is from the first year, what we got was a discourse which was essentially taken completely from the years of talking about the history of the nation, legitimizing the existence of the nation on the territory of Ontario, and therefore its right to self-determination. So what they did was to develop a site on a farm. So this is linked to the agricultural history. So you see again this reproduction of the boat coming across the sea, the sun coming up. This guy here with a thing around his head is a representation of Etienne Brûlé, who was a young guy who came over with the first boats and was sent off to go find out what was going on up the river. And he's become kind of a mythic figure, a romantic figure. Revisionist historians say actually he wasn't important at all, but we don't like to hear that. So the site was developed on a farm which already had moved a little bit away from straight agriculture. It became a place where you would take the family on a nice weekend in the fall to pick apples and have a picnic and have a nice day out in the country. And so in some sense, it was ripe for this kind of development. The picture up here is of me and Emmanuel de Silva, one of my research assistants, walking from the car. There's a whole big parking lot into the sites that they set up in order to make it make sense to come to this pageant. The pageant is held at night, 3 nights a week from June to August. It's outdoors on a huge site, and it mobilizes 300 members of the local community who used to be doing other things that are now invested in the development of this historical pageant. So the elite actors mobilize the community exactly in ways in which they used to mobilize the community, and as I'll show in a moment, in many ways still mobilize the community for defending language and defending identity. It's a bit out of the way and a bit hard to get to, so they started thinking about other things to do. So they started saying, well, you could come and have an authentic dinner. The plate full of food is meant to be traditional French-Canadian food. So we went for dinner and had a picnic outside. This is the farm site that it's held on. And this is the so-called pioneers. Sorry, 2003 was the first one. So the first 300 community volunteers who spend months during the winter and the spring sewing costumes, working on developing the set, writing the script, developing the music. And these are all people who do it on a volunteer basis. So you have to really be invested in this. So you have a kind of an event which is somehow halfway between a consciousness-raising activity and something that is supposed to develop tourism in the area. So this is supposed to be a magnet which will draw tourists to the area and develop tourism as an alternative economic base for a region in agricultural decline. And to get money, seed money from the federal government to start this, they had to present this in exactly these terms as a business plan, which was meant to attract tourists so that people would develop bed and breakfasts and hotels and restaurants and campsites and be able to capitalize in all kinds of ways around this event. And the business plan was a 5-year plan in which in the first year they would draw people locally, then they would increasingly expand geographically, and in the end have tourist coaches coming from places like Montreal, filled with people from Quebec or even from France, who would come and do the 2.5-hour ride to stay there for a night or two around the show. This is also something, it was developed on the basis of an existing format, an existing genre. The original one is Le Puy du Fou, which is in France in the Vendée. And it's also based on a show in Quebec, which started about 20 years ago, based on so there's a genealogy from France to Quebec to Ontario in terms of how they cooked up the genre. The show drew very well in the first year from the local population, partly because everybody had a sister or a cousin or a child or an uncle, and so everybody came to see the show. But the second year and the third year, it didn't draw from any farther away than the local region, for lots of reasons which we can go into, but partly among the criticisms were it's too didactic. It tells you, it hits you over the head with the important stories, the things we need to remember about all of the struggles that we've had against English Canada, all the struggles that we've had against the state, all the struggles that we have with globalization. And it's not entertaining. So, if you're going to drive 2 hours and spend your time, it has to be fun. It has to have. And so there were 2 different responses to this. Here what I'm showing you here is an extract, which I won't go into detail about, an extract from the local newspaper about the financial difficulties of the show. And for a couple of years, the discourse around those financial difficulties was, we need to rally the forces, we need to come to the defense. As we've come to the defense of the population, as we came to the defense of the population in 1913, when the government said that we couldn't use French as a language of instruction in our schools, as we came to the defense of a hospital the government was trying to close 5 years ago, we have to come to the defense of this show. So that particular discourse of rallying for rights is just transported into what is supposed to be a profit-making and economic developing kind of activity. So you have this particular text says, hey guys, everybody reading this, L'École d'un Peuple needs you, is what the headline says. So you need to come out, and the way in which you're going to defend our existence as a people and the way in which you're going to defend our language is by buying a ticket. So you used to defend our language by going to manifestation, by going to demonstrations. Now you buy a ticket. We have a new way of defending language. So this is sort of more of the same discourse. This time the onstage story of Franco-Ontarian survival is what is making headlines. We must now fight to save l'École d'un Peuple. So what happened, to make a long story short, was that the administration, the management of l'École d'un Peuple was removed because they were clearly not able to make the shift from the old discourse to the new discourse, from the old conditions to the new conditions. And what they put in place instead of l'École d'un Peuple, which was sort of run under the banner of something called Francocénie, with an emphasis on the theatrical dimensions, was to put into place a new organization called Franco-Biz. And Franco-Biz is an organization which is about helping people learn how to make a financial success out of historical pageants like this. So 4 years of struggle of trying to figure out how to make this work. We have, this is the mandate, the goal of Franco-Biz. I'll see if I can do a simultaneous, you want to do a simultaneous translation in Catalan?
Sí, Franco-Biz ofereix el seu suport I si és necessari assumirà la direcció de les manifestacions culturals, els espectacles I festivals franco-ontarians per tal de reforçar aquest sector d'activitat, reestructurar les operacions dels organismes que ho desitgin I que manifestin la necessitat a fi de rentabilitzar I d'ajudar-les a assolir el seu ple potencial.
So the key word here is rentabilitzar. Okay? This is not a discourse that we had 10 or 15 years ago, but it's a discourse that we have now. So this is the English translation, right? And we have sort of, this is more of the way in which, of the discourse of Franco-Biz, which is about, again, it's the same kind of thing. Another thing so one of the things that they did was to put more emphasis not only on the business savvy end of things, the business know-how end of things, but also to put more emphasis on the entertainment side of things. So I'll go back, I don't know if you remember, but the initial publicity was these kinds of images, very romantic, very bucolic also, very much connected to nature in this kind of romantic way. And now the new image is this one, so it's at night and it's very dramatic and you have all kinds of booming and lights flashing and you still have some of the old romantic nostalgia, but there's much more on, it happens, the top thing says, it happens at night. So there's kind of making something of the entertainment value of the night. I'll get back to the frog in a minute. So what we have in the space of 5 years is an example of the struggle of a linguistic minority to change its way of doing things under new conditions and to understand what it means to essentially, to commodify, to put on the market both its language and its identity. Now this pageant initially, I probably don't need to say, was in French, But one of the things that has also happened over the course of the last 5 years is a calling into question of who your consumers are. Is the Francophone market for uniquely Francophone goods actually big enough to make this sell? So after a couple of years, we went several times to this show. All of a sudden, we hear somebody saying at the beginning, introducing us, saying, you know, you're going to have a wonderful time tonight, it's going to be fabulous, all of this stuff in French, and then switching to English and saying, to our Anglophone friends who are here, we're so happy to have you. Now, you know, it doesn't really matter if you don't understand the language because there's lots of special effects and there's lots of great entertainment value and really good music, and you'll have a wonderful time. And then they would go back into French. So there's a realization that you have to deal with the realities of the market in Ontario, which is that if you're going to make if you're going to rentabiliser, you're going to have to deal with the Anglophones. Now, I don't need to tell you what a shocking thing this is to do for people who have been spending 30, 40 years trying to create spaces where English does not appear. And so people find themselves in this contradiction, which is very painful and very difficult to live through. And they're searching for ways of dealing with it which have not been resolved. I mean, we're still in the midst of the struggle. So we have the struggle which is essentially created by the new conditions of commodification of language and identity in ways which end up being very complicated. The language part ends up being more valuable in other kinds of heritage kinds of activities. One of the other things that we did was to follow produits du terroir, artisanal products. Productos del terre, I can't do the R. Which have been developed over the last 10 years, really, in Quebec. Such a thing really didn't exist before. And they're exported largely to, France is the big consumer market, except for things like maple syrup, I mean, they come to the Christmas, you look next time you're at a Christmas market here, I'll bet they're here with the maple syrup. They come and they do France and Germany and Spain with the maple syrup and with the flag and the French accent. Sorry? Really? The maple syrup? Oh, here you do it with, yes, it's the same thing, right, exactly. And in France, in order to sell these products, some of which are not obviously French-Canadian, you know, like soap, for example. They sell soap, they sell maple syrup, they sell liqueur made on the basis of raspberries or blueberries or things like that. Part of the packaging is the language packaging. And in an interview that we did with one of the managers, somebody whose business is to bring over these products and their vendors to Christmas markets in France, he's very clear about this. He says, you know, we look around, we hire Québécois. Because when people come, they say, you know, yes, we'll buy, but speak to us. Speak to us a little bit. We want to hear the accent. He said, you know, the accent, as I said, the accent is business. So in that particular situation, the language is the kind of the authenticating wrapping for a product which has added value only because it's locatable, in this particular case linguistically. They also use, you know, marks like the Quebec fleur de lis or the Canadian maple leaf. In some cases, certain kinds of images that might be associated with the romantic notion of Francophone Canada, or nature stuff sells very well in Europe, apparently. But the linguistic side of things there has a very important function as the thing which makes a product, a product del terra, authentic, and therefore interesting to buy. The last development that I just want to mention sorry about that. This is a kind of an ironic appropriation of the frog and of French for creating a space on the internet which is supposed to be for Francophone youth. So we've had a kind of a move from a very serious kind of romantic nationalism to something that's more kind of entertainment, Hollywood, Disney, to something that's more kind of ironic. It's kind of a skater ethic in ways that are, so it's kind of this ironic sensibility, which is the key sensibility of kids between the ages of 15 and 30, more or less. And that is developing more in the sector of music and the arts than in the area of tourism. But we're starting, which is why I give you an example from the internet, because we see it more in those spaces as opposed to the spaces that I've been talking about. So we have these new kinds of ways of thinking about language and identity in ways which use and mobilize these older symbols, but in ways that are appropriated under new conditions to do things that are really quite different from the things that we used to do. Now the question, of course, is what difference is this going to make? What does it mean in terms of who's going to get to decide who counts as a Francophone, a Catalan, an Anglophone, an indigenous person? What's going to count as speaking French, speaking English, speaking Catalan, speaking Castilian, being bilingual, being multilingual? These are all areas that are very, very, very much right now major terrains of struggle, major terrains of contestation, which have important consequences for things like getting a job, or for things like getting a diploma from a university or from high school even. So all of these things, I think, are being very much called into question in ways which challenge our older ways of doing things, which we're trying to maintain, but which I'm not sure we're not going to be able to hold on to for very much longer, which I think are going to have major consequences for the disciplines of linguistics, of anthropology, of sociology, certainly huge impact on areas of language policy, public policy regarding language, public policy regarding language and nation and state, in ways that I wouldn't dare to try to predict now, but that I think we really need to follow closely because it's really on the ground that this stuff is happening. I will stop there.
Bé, gràcies. En primer lloc, he sentit que barrejaves idiomes i llengua. Idiomes és una imposició que ens genera com una esclavitud, mentre que les llengües estan refugiades en família des dels orígens. Si pregunto com és que sí. Lògicament, com a investigador d'humanitats, el que valoro és la naturalesa que està abans, que està ara, que està després, perquè és un procés de que nosaltres som la suma de vida de dues persones, mare, pare, avi, àvia, besàvia, besàvia, fins als orígens dels temps. Aquests orígens dels temps van anar desenvolupant que teníem uns animalets de companyia al nostre voltant que tant podia ser per alimentar-nos, o lleons o d'allò, per, diguem, devorar-nos. Per tant, teníem que tenir una sensibilitat d'escoltar abans de ser eliminats. Per tant, sempre el so, el que no es veu, és el més important, perquè nosaltres, els nostres avantpassats i els teus, copiaven el so de tots aquests animalets a fi i efecte de que caiguessin en trampes i a fi i efecte d'eliminar-los, amb llances o el que sigui. Per tant, escoltar és el primer, tenir una anticipació de poder desenvolupar aquesta tasca. I llavors, les paraules ni es veuen, ni es toquen, ni s'agafen, però existeixen. Entren en aquest parell de forats negres que respiren en qualsevol so. Si aquest so és suau, és tendre, és dolç, és elegant, és noble, és coherent, lògicament podrem guanyar a qualsevol poder que compren, esclavitzen i maten. I suposo que aquest enriquiment anirà bé per tots.
Thank you for the commentary.
moment, a veure, hem entès que era un comentari més que una pregunta. Hi ha més preguntes? Endavant.
An additional thing what you're saying is that there's a tendency for languages to get a kind of, how should I say, symbolic branding. And I really noticed this when I was in Singapore and I saw this apartment complex that they were building and they were selling, it was called Estilo. And I was thinking, it's a very similar how Spanish has developed brand in one of the brands that it means, one of the meanings in New York or in States in general is sort of a sort of stylishness or a kind of coolness. And it's the same thing how it appears in Asia where nobody speaks it. And I'm wondering if you've been thinking about that or what that would mean in Quebec.
Well, it's not just a question of Quebec, right? As my colleague said, there are francophones outside Quebec. We're very sensitive about that. Tourism offices are very conscious of this. Right? We talked to some people at the Canadian Commission on Tourism, and they're talking about, how do we brand? We have to brand Canada, so we're tired. Canada is branded as Mounties, Moose, and I forget what the third thing is. But we want to remove that image from people's heads and instead put something else in them. So I think there are ways in which states actively are engaged in trying to control the branding of the national identity, including or using, sometimes using the language or including the language. Partly because, just to talk about the language part, language learning and teaching, I don't need to tell you, is big business. Right? One of the characteristics of the ways in which the new economy has evolved is that everybody wants access to the linguistic resources that are going to be helpful to them. And so there's a kind of a jockeying for position over who is going to get that market of consumers of linguistic goods. Is it going to be Spain? Is it going to be France? Is it going to be Britain? Is it going to be the States? Is it going to be Canada? Who's going to get that market? And the market is huge. The quote-unquote smaller languages are actually also in that market because they do control these particular kinds of resources. So, for example, Melissa Moyer and I and other people who are here in this room were in Western Ireland a year ago, in a place which is known as, the place for real, authentic Celtic music. You want to go and hear really good Irish music, that's where you go. It turns out that, the guy who makes all the Celtic jewelry, he's from Austria, and the guy who has the bar is from France. So everybody's from someplace else. You can't find somebody who's actually born in that town. So these are all people who've made an investment in Irish, in learning Irish, although that's not their language. So I don't think that this is only about the big languages. I think the business of getting access to linguistic resources is actually, it's part of what we call the language industry. So there's speech technology, there's language teaching, and there's translation. And those are sort of the big three of the emerging, zillion-dollar language industry, which parenthetically, the Canadian state 5 years ago decided we're a bit ahead of the game with respect to, for example, the States on this, because we've had to develop it because of our bilingualism. We're going to go sell this product to the European Union. So there's a lot of that, and the branding is I think part, and an important part, but it's part of that picture. The question is, who gets to decide what the content of the brand is? Right?
Bueno, faré la pregunta en totes dues llengües. Ho faré en català primer. Doncs volia saber com aquestes noves pràctiques multilingües que estan sorgint en el Quebec, quines conseqüències tindran o quina forma tindran per a redefinir la identitat quebecoa. So, did you understand it? So the question is, how are these new multilingual practices that are turning up and these things what consequences will this have for Quebecois or new Quebecois ways of defining themselves?
Or Franco-Ontarian or Acadian. I have to get this, the word Quebec is banned. Nobody's allowed to say the word Quebec Québécois. It's not, nobody's allowed to say it for the next 15 minutes. What I see happening in my neck of the woods are different kinds of struggles. And so, I mean, I don't know what the consequences will be. I hope to discover. This is what, is keeping me going in the research field these days. But I see a couple of things happening. One is that in the part of this story, which is about language as technical skill, you get real competition over who gets to decide what counts as competence in language XYZ and who counts as a competent speaker. So that, for example, many native speakers of French who come from the working class in Canada speak a vernacular, they speak a variety of French, which is not standard, which is not, quote unquote, le bon français, it's not, quote unquote, good French. Whereas English speakers who have only learned their French in school only speak the standard. The vernacular is not a problem. And so there are people who will say, I'd rather have the English speaker with the schooled French than the French speaker who speaks that weirdo, dialecty weirdo thingy, which is not as a mess. It's not real language. Or even, and the third party in the competition are more recent immigrants and refugees from former Francophone, former French colonies, notably Africa, but not only, who are they speak French because they're members of the elite. They were schooled in the neo-colonial institutions that France exports to Africa. They speak European French. They also think that this Canadian stuff is really bizarre. And for many people, their French is much more elegant, much more convincing. So you have this kind of three-way competition for who gets to count as a Francophone, whereas in the past, you could just sort of count on your Francophone person to be bilingual, and you didn't look too carefully because it didn't actually matter that much, right? So there's sort of this way in which language is being kind of disconnected or fought over. And the argument there is that, this will be familiar to you, this is our common language. We don't have to share culture, we don't have to share identity, we share a space. It's civic national discourse is a kind of the attempt to recuperate that. But the ugly side of it is that it's competitive and can turn very ugly. But so there can be a struggle over who owns the language and what are the criteria for deciding who owns the language. The other side of it are these ways in which commodifying identity, selling your heritage, can be disconcerting. People don't really want to folklorize themselves. It can be very disconcerting to be a commodity and to embody authenticity in these ways. And so that can be very disturbing. And I think it's one of the reasons why we get this kind of third thing emerging, which is what I think of as a kind of a post-national irony. Although there are ways in which I sort of think, Catalan irony is like way ahead of us. You've cornered the market on irony. But that irony is one of the ways in which we deal with those contradictions, trying to neutralize them, but they're a reflection on a kind of an impasse. That the old ways of doing things, and this is most explicitly formulated in Acadie in Eastern Canada, where people who are now in their 20s and 30s say, we don't want to have anything to do with that old discourse of national struggle. This is a new world, we want to do things differently. And then the militant activists of the older generation turn around and say, well, what do you want to do? And there's no alternative discourse developed yet. So I feel like we're on the cusp of something. We're on the cusp of having to reinvent something. But we feel the need to reinvent something, but we don't know what it is.
I'll put my question in Catalan. It's much easier for me. Em sembla que heu analitzat d'una manera bastant minuciosa un producte cultural i l'evolució que ha fet des del seu caràcter original cap a un mimetisme, diria jo, amb respecte a les grans produccions mediàtiques. Em pregunto si en els vostres estudis heu analitzat també la simbologia de les llengües en les més gran consum, és a dir, quina simbologia lingüística transmeten productes de més consum a Ontario en anglès, quina simbologia lingüística transmeten els productes de més consum cultural en francès, perquè probablement també hi ha aquí diguéssim, una batalla o una disputa simbòlica que suposo que ajudaria a entendre per què una petita batalla amb un espectacle identitari ha seguit el camí que ha seguit. Segurament hi ha un taló de fons, hi ha un marc més ampli dins del qual aquests fets troben una altra lectura.
It's a really interesting question. I think it depends a lot on the market. So I'll give you an example from another part of Canada, again from New Brunswick, which has seen the emergence of a francophone bourgeoisie, which didn't exist in the past. You had a professional elite and the working class and nothing in between. And now, for the first time, there is an emergence of a bourgeoisie with bourgeois interests and bourgeois tastes. We've seen the development of these refined products, the development of locally produced artisanal cheeses. Music has become an important area as well, so that the Anglophone population in that area now looks to the Francophone population as a space where things are happening. Okay? There's stuff happening, there's musicians, there's festivals, there's good food to eat, there's markets, and so things in that market, things that are wrapped in French, are interesting to everybody. They're interesting to the Francophones because it's their stuff, and it's interesting to Anglophones because it's cool. It's cool in ways that Anglophones themselves cannot produce. I would say the same thing is true in Quebec. It's not so clear to me that it's true in Ontario. So I think this is starting to emerge in other more English-dominant areas, but the competition for the attention of the consumer, of the English-speaking consumer in Ontario or Western Canada, is intense. And you can get lots of interesting things. If anything, I would say the thing that gets people's attention is probably stuff wrapped in Indigenous languages. So people are very interested in Cree, they're interested in Ojibwe, they're interested in Inuktitut. They're very interested in that. French is sort of next rank, maybe. And also in a place like Toronto is full of people from all over the world, so there's a lot of competition for the attention of the consumer for authentic, linguistically wrapped goods. I'm not sure, French is just sort of in the mix with all of the other ones. Having said that, though, it is in the mix, and it's understood as being in the mix. However, a place like Ontario, people still generally feel that Anglophone Ontarians are probably going to be the last people really interested in Francophone Ontario. They'll be more interested in Quebec than they are going to be with Francophones close to home. And so if you're after English speakers, you're after Americans who come to Ontario anyway as tourists and who think French is interesting and exotic. So the one piece of the market people aren't going for, they're not even trying to go far for, is English Canada, which is not the case, let's say, in New Brunswick. But on the whole, I think people are very oriented towards the European French market, partly because they're coming to Canada anyway. There's this whole myth about, Canada and the spaces and our cousins overseas. So there's a very well-developed link between France and Canada, and they're trying to capitalize on that.
Amb permís de la Mònica, volia començar fent una pregunta al públic. Soc de l'equip de la Càtedra de multilingüísme i estem muntant conferències, no anava a dir constantment, amb una certa periodicitat. De vegades hi ha 20 persones, de vegades hi ha 30 persones. Avui és un èxit rodó i no sé ben bé si és perquè és el mes de juliol i tots tenim ganes de sortir o si hi ha alguna altra motivació. Sigui com sigui, no voldria que el debat fos sobre això, perquè òbviament la protagonista és la Mònica. Però en tot cas, si hi ha gent que ha vingut per primera vegada avui, la majoria ja ens hem vist en alguna ocasió, si hi ha gent que ha vingut per primera vegada avui i que s'ha assabentat de l'acte per algun mecanisme no habitual, l'Alexia aquí al davant, que ara aixecarà la mà, que és la que porta la càtedra, en definitiva, recolliria adreces electròniques, per exemple, que anem fent un llistat cada cop més llarg de gent interessada. Ara sí, perdona'm, Mònica, però volia aprofitar aquesta ocasió. Ara sí, un comentari, una pregunta. No sé si en aquesta mateixa sala, Catherine Woolard, fa cosa de 6 mesos, en un altre cicle d'aquesta càtedra, ens va fer una conferència molt interessant sobre les bases, diguéssim, legitimadores de polítiques lingüístiques. I ha utilitzat els mateixos termes que has utilitzat tu parlant de productes culturals. Parlava de el que vol defensar una llengua minoritzada, que el que fa és apel·lar a l'autenticitat, és a dir, l'origen, les arrels, la geografia, i en canvi el que apel·la a una llengua dominant trobem que utilitza un discurs d'anonimitat, que és de tothom i no és de ningú. És una llengua comuna, però no sap ben bé qui és l'autor. M'ha fet molta gràcia trobar elements d'aquests dos discursos, i no és casualitat, suposo, en diferents aspectes del que has dit. La meva pregunta seria una mica ingènua. Les relacions entre anglòfons i francòfons fan que sigui impensable que un producte identificat com d'origen franco-canadenc perdi mercat en un mercat anglo-canadenc. Aniré a l'extrem. És imaginable que un producte típicament franco-canadenc, per exemple, el xampany, sigui víctima d'un boicot per part del Canadà anglòfon, o això és ciència-ficció total? Gràcies.
Well, first of all, on the Kid Willard front, of course, Kid and I talk to each other, so yes, it's not very surprising, right? So we have the question of the circulating discourses of linguistic anthropologists in North America. I mean, I think there's sort of more to say about the authenticity-anonymity split. I mean, I think to a certain extent, that is certainly among the things that we have seen, but I precisely think that there are ways in which those kinds of dichotomies may not be holding anymore because the conditions aren't there the way they used to be. On the issue of I mean, it's unthinkable to me that any Anglophone Canadian would boycott champagne, but especially if it were cheaper than the stuff we have to import from Catalonia. But I think there are ways in which the Anglophone population is very split in its relationship to Francophone Canada. So you have one part of the elite, really, having invested since the mid-1960s in bilingualism, and who are completely on board with this notion that being able to speak English and French is a really good thing, and it's only going to be helpful to us, and who go through all kinds of things. They send their kids, they line up overnight to send their kids to French immersion, in Calgary. They send their kids to summer camp where they only speak French. They go to France. They do all kinds of things. So that's one particular fragment of essentially the middle class and the upper middle class. In other areas, feelings run in an opposite direction because people feel threatened. It's not so politically correct a position to take anymore, but it doesn't take a whole lot for people to come out and start burning Quebec flags. They're not necessarily going to boycott tourtière, the products, don't measure up, but just when you think everything is fine and everybody is on board with this, something happens and people get really angry and do very ugly things. So the question I think that we need to ask ourselves is, what kinds of people are investing in a notion of personal bilingualism? In some cases, that notion of personal bilingualism has nothing to do with nationalism. People will tell you, if you offered my kid bilingual education in English and Russian, I'd go for it. Or English and Swahili, I don't care. Learning more than one language, we happen to have French, wonderful. But it's not because I'm Canadian, that I care about that in particular. Other people will talk about, this is our country, and I want my family to be in the image of the country, and I want to be able to move around. So you get different kinds of justifications. But largely, I read it as a middle-class investment in being able to compete for middle-class jobs, which require being able to deal with the Canadian market, and which give you an advantage in the global market insofar as both English and French are interesting languages outside of Canada. So I don't think the national stuff is really that. No, I mean, people may think of it that way and they may believe it, but I'm not sure that's really what's behind it. I think it's more a question of protecting a class position against the rise of the francophone bourgeoisie, who have easy access to English, and who, for the first time historically, are competing for the same kinds of positions with Anglophones, absolutely in the public sector, and to a lesser extent in the private sector. That sometimes does turn ugly. You talk to civil servants working for the federal government in Ottawa, there's a lot of anger. I mean, it doesn't take much on both sides, both the Francophone and the Anglophone side. We're not allowed to, this is a taboo subject. So if the Canadian Embassy calls you, I didn't say that, okay? Well, they're gonna take away my passport. It's our ugly secret. Because it's really bad, it's competition which we're not, it's conflict actually, which we have not developed the tools for dealing with. We understand very little because we don't want to ask the question about those Anglophones who remain angry about sharing space with Francophones. I mean, the ones who burn the flag or who trample the flag. We don't understand them very well unless you're part of the community, because I guess we're ashamed and we don't want to talk about that. On the surface of it, I would say a reasonable sociological hypothesis would be that these are people who may not be threatened directly in their own jobs, although that may also be the case. I think that happens in the public service. You find it in places like New Brunswick, but they may be people who see their potential for social mobility as threatened. So it may not be so immediate, it may have more to do with projections for their own future or for their children's future. But that's a hypothesis. So, ugliness is not unknown.
Molt bé, doncs ho podem tancar aquí. Moltes gràcies i fins a la propera.
I moltes gràcies als traductors.